Tonight, drift back 252 million years, before dinosaurs, before mammals, to a world where the ocean was the safer place to be. The land was dominated by saber-toothed predators the size of bears, hostile climate with almost no safe ground between one danger and the next, and fresh water that hid its own killers. This is the story of the Lopingian, the one window in Earth's history when the rules between land and sea ran in reverse. There is a period in Earth's history that most people have never heard of, sitting in a gap between two more famous eras, leaving almost no trace in popular imagination, despite being one of the most consequential stretches of time life on this planet has ever passed through. It has no famous creatures attached to it in the way the Jurassic has its sauropods or the Cretaceous has its tyrannosaurs. It has no cultural footprint. But what happened during this period, specifically what the world looked like and how it was organized, tells a story that runs against almost everything we assume about prehistoric danger. The period is called the Lopinian, and it ran from approximately 259 to 252 million years ago. That places it well before the first dinosaur set foot on land, before the first mammal drew breath, and before most of the animal groups that feel even remotely familiar to us had come into existence. The creatures alive during the Lopingian belonged to lineages that are now entirely gone, operating inside a world whose basic physical properties were measurably different from the one we inhabit now. The geography was unrecognizable. The climate ran on different rules. Even the length of a day was not what it is now. Understanding what the Lopingian actually was requires setting aside the map entirely, every continent sitting in its familiar position, every ocean occupying its familiar basin, and replacing it with something far stranger. What existed instead was a configuration of land and water that operated by its own internal logic, and understanding it requires starting from the geography rather than the creatures. But here is where the Lopingian starts to complicate any easy framing of it. The instinct, when hearing about a world this foreign, is to file it under dangerous everywhere equally, a prehistoric baseline of uniform hostility that applied to every environment without distinction. That instinct is wrong, and the way it is wrong matters, because the Lopingian wasn't dangerous in every direction simultaneously. It was dangerous in specific places for specific reasons, while other environments were running a completely different set of conditions at exactly the same time. But the physical facts of Pangaea made that asymmetry sharper than it would appear at first. A single land mass with no internal seas meant that whatever developed on land, whatever predator, whatever climate condition, whatever ecological pressure, spread across the entire continental surface without geographic interruption. There were no isolated regions where a new predator group could scale up without eventually reaching the ecosystems on the other side of the continent. What evolved in one part of Pangaea could and did reach the rest of it, and the land was connected in a way that amplified every threat that emerged anywhere on it. But the sea operated under entirely different rules. Pantalassa and the surrounding oceans didn't share that connectivity with the land. What happened in a marine ecosystem after an extinction event is not the same as what happens in a terrestrial one. The timescales differ, the pressures differ, and the outcomes differ. The Lopinian opened with those two systems running in opposite directions, and the gap between them was not closing, it was widening. When you piece all of this together, the Lopinian wasn't just a different chapter in Earth's history, it was a completely different book. The days were shorter because the moon sat closer, pulling harder on Earth's rotation. and compressing time itself into 22-hour cycles. Every landmass that exists today as a separate continent was fused into a single unbroken mass called Pangaea, which meant no dividing oceans to moderate temperature, no coastal weather systems to distribute rainfall, no geographic boundaries to contain what lived where. The interior of that supercontinent cooked at an average of 35 degrees Celsius, not as a peak temperature, but as a daily average, while seasonal extremes pushed far beyond that in the stretches of land farthest from any coast. The central Permian Mountains didn't just shape the landscape, they blocked moisture from reaching the interior, creating rain shadows that turned enormous sections of Pangaea into dead zones where almost nothing grew and almost nothing could live. The equatorial belt was largely desert. The oceans, specifically Panthalassa, which wrapped around the western face of Pangaea and covered more than 60% of Earth's surface, were twice the size of today's Pacific. That number is difficult to hold in the mind, but it meant that most of the planet was water, and most of the land was either too hot, too dry, or too dangerous to cross without consequence. The Lapindian wasn't a world where life was thriving uniformly across the globe. Life had been forced into corners, river basins in what is now South Africa, floodplain systems in what is now European Russia, pockets of survivable terrain surrounded on all sides by hostile land, while the sea was still recovering from the Capetanian extinction 2 million years prior. On land, the pressure was already building. In the water, it wasn't. That difference was 7 million years in the making. If this is the kind of history that keeps you up at night, or helps you drift off to it, drop a comment below with what surprised you most so far. We read every one. But before any of that makes sense, the ocean needs explaining first, because the assumption most people carry, that the prehistoric sea was always the more dangerous of the two, is exactly the assumption this period breaks. What swam in Lopingian waters was not what you'd expect. And the reason why comes down to an extinction event most people have never heard of. One that hit marine life harder than the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs. What it left behind in the ocean, and what that absence meant for everything happening on land, is where this story actually begins. When most people picture the prehistoric ocean, the instinct is to assume danger scales with age. The further back you go, the reasoning tends to go, the more monstrous the sea. There is some truth to that in certain periods. The Devonian had giant armored fish, the Jurassic had long-necked marine reptiles stretching over 10 meters, and the Cretaceous produced mosasaurs capable of swallowing prey whole. The ocean across deep time has generally earned its reputation as the more hostile of the two major environments, and that reputation has held across most of Earth's history. But the Lopinian is not most of Earth's history. 2 million years before the Lopinian began, an extinction event called the Capetanian had moved through the planet and left specific, measurable damage behind. The Capetanian is not well known. It sits in the shadow of the far more famous Permian-Triassic extinction that came later, but its effects on marine life were severe enough to change the entire character of the ocean for millions of years afterward. The question of what swam in Lopingian seas is therefore not a question about what had evolved by that point. It is a question about what had survived. That distinction matters because the answer it produces is not what the ocean's reputation would suggest. The seas, during the Lopinian, were a diminished version of what they had been, a gap between what had previously occupied the top of the marine food chain and what remained after the Capetanian had moved through. Ecosystems functioned Creatures fed and died in the usual ways, but the scale of what had once been there and what now filled that space were not comparable. The ocean of the Lopinian looked nothing like the ocean of the periods before or after it. But the Capitanian extinction's effect on the ocean wasn't simply a reduction in numbers, it was a structural collapse, the removal of the animals that had organized the marine food web from the top down, leaving everything below them without the same ecological framework it had operated inside for millions of years. When apex predators disappear from an ecosystem, the system doesn't simply continue at a lower intensity. It reorganizes, and reorganization takes time. The Lopinian seas were in that reorganization phase, functional but not recovered, and not producing the kind of large-bodied predators that a fully mature marine ecosystem tends to generate. But what makes this significant is the comparison it forces. The Capitanian extinction had hit both land and sea simultaneously, but the two systems it hit were not comparable in how they responded. Marine recovery and terrestrial recovery run on different timescales and produce different interim conditions. And during the Lopingian, those interim conditions were pulling apart from each other. One environment was depleted at the top, the other was filling rapidly from the bottom up, producing new apex predators and scaling them towards sizes the earlier period hadn't reached. But the ocean produced nothing to match what was happening on land. The marine apex predator niche sat largely unfilled at the scale it had previously been occupied, not because no animals were present, but because the extinction had taken out the lineages most capable of filling it, and the survivors were mid-tier animals that hadn't evolved the size or killing architecture to replace what was gone. The seas were quieter than they had been, and the land was not. That divergence is the entire mechanism behind what made the Lopinian unusual. The answer to what lurked in the Lopinian seas is far less than you'd expect. The Capitanian extinction had come through 2 million years earlier and hit marine ecosystems harder than any other environment. Helicoprion, the spiral-toothed shark that had reached 8 meters and become one of the defining predators of the earlier Permian, was already gone. What remained in its place were its much smaller relatives, the largest being Agassizidas at around 2 meters, built not for ambushing large prey, but for hunting soft-bodied animals like squid. Other surviving shark families, the sphenacanthids and hybodonts, were smaller still, topping out at roughly 1 meter in length. These were not apex predators. They were mid-tier animals filling a depleted ecosystem. The sea scorpions, Eurypterids, were approaching the end of their lineage entirely. During the Devonian, they had been enormous and dominant. By the Lopinian, only 2 genera survived, neither of them large, neither occupying anything close to an apex role. Trilobites, ammonoids, and cephalopods were still present, but in numbers that told a story of ongoing decline rather than recovery. Panthalassa and the surrounding seas were not empty, but they were quiet in a way that had no parallel on land. There was no Lopingian marine equivalent of what gorgonopsids were doing on the surface. There was no aquatic predator in this period reaching the size, speed, or killing capability of the animals prowling Pangaea. 2 million years after the Capitanian event, nothing in the ocean came close to what was already running across Pangaea's surface. The seas were recovering from a mass extinction. Land was not recovering, it was escalating. When the Capitanian extinction cleared the animals that had previously held the apex predator roles on land, it left a vacancy. And what moved into that vacancy didn't settle. The predator group that filled it kept growing, kept expanding its range and kept producing larger and more capable hunters across the entire duration of the Lopinian. The largest of them appeared equally at home in the heat of South African floodplains and the cold of Russian desert, ranging across 2 hemispheres without apparent constraint. But in Austransvivia wasn't the whole story, and understanding why requires looking at what was evolving on the other side of Pangaea at exactly the same time. Every major period in Earth's history has had a group of animals that, when you look at the fossil record, clearly ran things on land. The Carboniferous had its giant amphibians. The Triassic would eventually give rise to the Archosaurs. The Cretaceous belongs entirely to the dinosaurs. Each of these periods has a dominant group that left behind enough fossils, enough range, and enough ecological presence that the story of land life in that era is essentially inseparable from the story of that group. The Lopinian is no different, except that the group it belongs to is one almost no one outside of paleontology has heard of. Before Gorgonopsids became what they were during the late Permian, they were small. The earliest members of the group appeared around 265 million years ago and were modest in size, limited in range, and nowhere near the top of any significant food chain. They existed beneath a world dominated by larger therapsids called dinocephalians, heavy-bodied animals that held the apex predator roles across most terrestrial ecosystems during the Middle Permian. Gorgonopsids in those years were not the story, but ecological vacancies have a way of being filled quickly in geological terms, and when the Capitanian extinction removed the dinocephalians from the picture, the world those animals had occupied became suddenly and completely open. What moved into that space was a set of ecological roles that had just opened, and Gorgonopsids filled those roles at a speed that the fossil record registers as essentially immediate. They didn't inherit a quiet world. They inherited one with everything to play for, and the Lopingian is what they made of it. But the story of Gorgonopsids is not simply one of expansion into open space. It is one of escalation, of each successive genus pushing further in size, further in range, and further in killing capacity than the one before it, across a window of time that saw no competing group capable of slowing that trajectory. The dinocephalians had kept Gorgonopsids constrained. Without them, the constraint was gone, and what the fossil record shows in the Lopinian is a group running almost entirely without ecological ceiling. But in Austransvivia is the point where that escalation reaches its most legible expression. At that scale, with upright limbs and canines built for penetrating large prey, it is not a mid-tier animal that got lucky in a depleted ecosystem. It is the product of sustained directional selection toward a specific predatory role, large, fast, capable of taking large prey across a wide range of environments. The adaptability it showed across different biomes is not incidental. It tells you the animal was not constrained by habitat in the way most predators are. But the Rubiginae complicate the picture further because they represent a separate lineage arriving at giant predatory forms through a different evolutionary path. Evolving on one side of the continent, while the Russian Gorgonopsids scaled up on the other. The Rubiginae produced skulls designed for grappling with large prey independently of anything happening elsewhere on Pangaea. That independent convergence on the same predatory outcome in two separate lineages at roughly the same time is not the kind of record that leaves herbivores with comfortable options. It is the kind that produces extreme evolutionary responses in everything trying to live alongside it. What the Lopinian produced in Gorgonopsids was something that had no real precedent. A group of saber-toothed predators that achieved complete ecological dominance across most of the habitable land on Earth before the age of dinosaurs. They had started small 265 million years ago, hunting small prey as fox-sized animals operating beneath a larger world. But the Capetanian extinction cleared the dinocephalians, the previous large therapsid rulers, and left a vacancy at the top of the food chain that Gorgonopsids moved into aggressively and permanently. Inostransphevia was the peak of that trajectory, at over 3.5 meters long and exceeding 450 kilograms, with curved upper canines measuring 15 centimeters and serrated along their length. It was the largest terrestrial predator the late Permian produced. Its limbs were not the sprawling, low-to-ground arrangement of most reptiles. They were upright and powerful, built for speed across open terrain. It appeared in warm South African floodplains and in cold Russian desert environments with equal adaptability, which tells you that whatever it needed, it found, because the ecosystems it moved through had no answer for it. But Inostransphevia wasn't alone, and that's the part that matters. The Rubiginae evolved independently in South Africa and produced their own line of giant Gorgonopsids. Rubiga atrox, reaching 3 meters with a skull occupying over 15% of its total body length, and deeply serrated teeth thought to be even more effective at cutting than Inostransspheres. In European Russia, medium and large Gorgonopsids occupied every predator niche, from small prey up. Gorgonopsids didn't just exist at the top of individual ecosystems. They were the top of nearly every terrestrial ecosystem across both hemispheres. Herbivores, regardless of their size, had a Gorgonopsid as their primary predator. The land during the Lopinian was not simply dangerous, it was structured around these animals. Gorgonopsids alone would have been enough to make Lopingian land exceptional. But the land during this period wasn't running one predator guild, it was running two, and the second one filled the gaps the first had left open. Therocephalians covered different size classes, used different killing methods, and occupied the same ecosystems as Gorgonopsids across 4 continents. Some of them may have carried something no tetrapod on Earth had ever carried before, and if the skull evidence holds, it changes what surviving an encounter with one of them would have actually meant. A world with one group of dominant predators is dangerous enough. The Lopingian, as it turns out, did not stop at one, running parallel to the Gorgonopsids across the same land, across overlapping ranges, and in many cases the same specific ecosystems, was a second group of therapsid predators that the fossil record has preserved across 4 continents. They were distinct from Gorgonopsids in their anatomy and in the strategies they used to kill, but they occupied the same basic position in the food web. Carnivores hunting the herbivores that shared Lopinian Pangaea with them. Therocephalians are less well known than Gorgonopsids even within paleontological circles, which is partly a function of their size. The largest Gorgonopsids were more visually striking, and size tends to determine which prehistoric animals attract sustained attention. But the Therocephalians compensated for their generally smaller frames in ways that the fossil record has only recently begun to fully reveal, and some of what it has revealed is genuinely unusual, even by the standards of a period already full of unusual animals. What made Therocephalians worth paying close attention to was not any single feature, but the range of different approaches to predation that the group developed across its various lineages. They were diverse in a way that Gorgonopsids were not, and that diversity meant they filled hunting roles and occupied ecological spaces that Gorgonopsids, despite their dominance, had left open. The land, during the Lopinian, was not running a single predator guild. It was running two, and the fossil record of what herbivores did in response tells you exactly what that meant for anything trying to survive between them. But Ferocephalians were not simply a secondary predator guild running parallel to Gorgonopsids without interaction. Their ranges overlapped directly. In South Africa, Gorgonopsids and Ferocephalians shared the same floodplain systems. In European Russia, Ferocephalians occupied river basins that Gorgonopsids also patrolled. The ecological separation between the two groups was not clean geographic separation. It was niche separation within the same space, which meant any herbivore moving through those environments was not navigating around one predator type, it was navigating around two simultaneously. But the implications of Ferocephalian venom, if confirmed, go beyond the animals themselves. Venom as a predatory tool changes the cost-benefit calculation for prey in a specific way. It removes the possibility that surviving an initial encounter is enough. A prey animal that escapes a Gorgonopsid slash-and-bleed attack has a chance if it can put enough distance between itself and the predator before blood loss becomes critical. A prey animal bitten by a venomous predator carries the attack with it. Distance doesn't help. The venom continues working regardless of where the animal goes afterward. But even setting the venom question aside, Megawatzia at 3 meters represents a Ferocephalian operating at the same size class as the largest Gorgonopsids, which means the predator landscape of European Russia during the first half of the Lopinian included at least one Ferocephalian large enough to compete directly with Inostron sphere for prey. Two groups of large apex predators in the same region hunting the same animals. The herbivore record from those areas reflects exactly what that meant. Gorgonopsids were not the ceiling of what land animals had to deal with. Ferocephalians shared the same ecosystems across Russia, Antarctica, Africa, and China. And while most were smaller bodied than the largest Gorgonopsids, they compensated in other ways. Moschkorinus was jaguar-sized, with a skull proportioned like a lion's, far too large for its body. And the evidence from its fossils points to a hunter that used powerful forelimbs to pin prey before applying its teeth, a technique distinct from the slash-and-bleed methods associated with Gorgonopsids. It reached apex predator status in certain environments without needing the raw size of Inostron sphere. That fact alone tells you the land wasn't just dominated from one angle. Megawatzia, at 3 meters, was the largest Ferocephalian known, and the skull evidence it left behind includes what may be venom glands and delivery ducts, structures that could have allowed it to inject lethal doses into prey during a bite. This is not fully accepted across the paleontological community, but the skull morphology is specific enough to make the hypothesis serious. Two smaller Ferocephalians, Ichibengops and Eukarebops, show similar indicators, which would make Ferocephalians the first tetrapods in Earth's history to evolve venom, predating the first venomous snakes by at least 240 million years. Ferocephalians added something to Lopingian land that Gorgonopsids alone didn't provide: a second predator guild, differently built, differently hunting, covering environments and prey sizes that Gorgonopsids may not have fully occupied. The land wasn't controlled by one group of apex predators, it was layered with them, and those layers overlapped. Two guilds of apex predators sharing the same ecosystems across 4 continents, that pressure had to produce a response in the animals living alongside it, and it did. The herbivores of the Lopinian were the most diverse group of land animals in the period, not because conditions were favorable, but because the selection pressure was so intense that only animals with serious structural answers to it left descendants. What those answers looked like, and what it says about the predators that drove them, is what the fossil record of Lopingian herbivores actually shows. Predator pressure of the kind the Lopinian produced does not go unanswered in evolution. When carnivores dominate an ecosystem, to the degree that gorgonopsids and therocephalians dominated the late Permian, the herbivores sharing that ecosystem face a choice that plays out not through decision-making, but through selection. The animals with traits that reduce their chances of being killed leave more descendants, and over generations, those traits become the defining features of entire lineages. The Lopingian herbivores are, in that sense, a direct record of what the predators were doing to them. What is striking about the herbivore record from this period is not that survival strategies existed, or prey animals have them, but that multiple entirely separate lineages arrived at serious, structurally committed solutions during the same geological window. These were not minor behavioral adjustments. They were large-scale anatomical commitments that cost something to build and maintain, which means the selection pressure behind them was correspondingly intense. Animals don't evolve expensive features unless the alternative is worse. The range of approaches those herbivores took is a record not just of what herbivores could do, but of what they were being forced to answer. When separate lineages with no shared ancestry in the relevant traits independently converge on solutions within the same period and the same continent, the thing driving that convergence was consistent, widespread, and not getting any easier to survive. The Lopingian predators were all of those things, but the burrowing strategy, for all its structural commitment, had a ceiling. A burrow protects an animal from surface predators only for as long as the animal stays inside it. Burrowing herbivores still needed to feed, still needed to move between food sources, and still needed to navigate the same surface environment that made burrowing necessary in the first place. The burrowers of the Lopingian were not exempt from surface exposure. They were simply better positioned to survive the intervals between it than animals with no underground option. But the armored strategy had a different problem. A ton-plus animal moving slowly and relying on passive armor was betting that no predator in its environment could breach that armor consistently enough to make hunting it worthwhile. That calculation appears to have been wrong. The skull morphology of the largest Rubiginae specifically points towards grappling with large, heavily built prey. The armor that Periosaurs carried was a genuine defensive investment, but it was a defensive investment that the predators sharing their ecosystem appear to have been selected to overcome. But the convergence on extreme strategies across separate lineages during the same period points to a deeper problem that no individual solution fully resolved. The predator pressure on Lopinian herbivores was not localized, not seasonal, and not reducible to a single predator type that a sufficiently specialized defense could address. Gorgonopsids and therocephalians covered every option available to herbivores. Different size classes, different hunting methods, different killing strategies. The land during the Lopingian did not offer herbivores a single problem to solve. It offered several, running simultaneously. Herbivores during the Lopinian were not passive victims of a world stacked against them. They were the most diverse group of land animals in this period, precisely because the pressure on them was so intense that only animals with real, specific, structural answers to that pressure survived long enough to leave descendants. The variety of those answers is the clearest evidence of how severe the predation was. Lystrosaurus burrowed. It used tusks and powerful forelimbs to dig shelters deep enough to provide meaningful protection. A strategy that, for an animal roughly the size of a pig, represented a significant metabolic investment in security rather than speed or armor. Sister cephalids did the same thing through a completely independent evolutionary line, using their broad skulls to displace soil. Two separate herbivore groups arriving at the same solution in the same environment within the same geological window is not coincidence. It is a direct response to what was living above ground. Parasaurs went the opposite direction. Scutosaurus weighed over 1.2 tons, carried bony scutes embedded through its skin, had skull spikes, and was built with such dense musculature that its soft tissue was effectively impenetrable in key areas. It moved slowly and made no attempt to outrun anything. But Rubidia atrox, based on skull thickness, bossing, and bite-grapple morphology, is specifically thought to have targeted animals of Scutosaurus's size and frame. Even the heaviest armor the Lopinium produced was not a guarantee. Herbivores evolved extreme solutions, and the predators evolved past them. The arms race was running at full speed, and land was where all of it was happening. But no herbivore strategy resolved the fundamental problem of the Lopinian landscape, which was that there was no zone of it on the surface where predator pressure dropped to zero. The burrowers still had to come up. The armored animals still had to move, and any animal that followed the instinct to head for water when threatened on land was moving toward a set of environments that had their own predator guilds waiting in them, built around exactly the kind of approach a thirsty animal makes toward a riverbank. In most ecosystems, the boundary between terrestrial and aquatic habitat carries some protective logic for land animals under threat. Water changes the rules. It slows pursuit. It disrupts scent trails. It places a physical barrier between a predator built for land and prey that has crossed into a different medium. Rivers and lakes have functioned as partial refuges across many periods of Earth's history, and the instinct to move toward water when threatened is not irrational. It is a reasonable calculation based on how most land-based predators operate. The Lopinian, however, did not honor that calculation. The freshwater environments of Pangaea, the river systems of South Africa, the lake basins of European Russia, the wetlands that formed where rainfall was sufficient to sustain them, were not unoccupied buffer zones between dangerous terrestrial ecosystems. They were occupied environments in their own right, with their own predator guilds, and those guilds had been shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that had produced the large carnivores on land. The animals that lived at the boundary between water and land during the Lopengian belonged to groups with deep evolutionary histories in ambush hunting. Some could operate on land. Some waited in the shallows. Some patrolled the water's edge in ways that made approaching a river one of the more consequential decisions a Lopingian herbivore could make. The freshwater environment didn't sit outside the predator network of the late Permian, and the animals waiting in and around those rivers were not waiting quietly. But the temnospondyle record makes the freshwater situation significantly worse than the simple presence of large amphibians would suggest. Uranocentrodon, at 4 meters, was not a generalist. Its entire morphology had been built around a specific hunting moment, the approach, and anything coming within range of a concealed ambush predator of that size in shallow water was already inside the kill zone before the encounter registered as a threat. The animals approaching the rivers of South Africa to drink were not encountering a large animal that happened to be dangerous. They were entering a system that had been structured around intercepting exactly that kind of approach. But proto-rasukids extended that risk beyond the water itself. Their capacity to operate on land meant the transition zone between terrestrial and aquatic habitat was not a clear boundary with defined rules on each side. A proto-suchid could move away from the river, wait on the bank, and intercept prey at a point where the prey might reasonably have assumed it was still in terrestrial predator territory. The ambiguity of that boundary, the fact that semi-aquatic predators made the water's edge into a zone of compounded risk rather than a transition point, is what removed the protective logic that freshwater habitats carry in most ecosystems. But the distribution of these freshwater predators is the most revealing part of the record. Temnospondyle amphibians were present in the same regions as the largest gorgonopsids and therocephalians. Protoroseuchids were present on virtually every continent the Lopenian record covers. The river systems of Pangaea were not isolated pockets of danger. They were a continent-wide network of ambush environments, each one occupied by predators that had been building toward exactly that role for millions of years. The rivers and lakes of Lopinian Pangaea were not a retreat from the dangers on land. They were a continuation of them in a different medium. Temnospondyle amphibians had claimed freshwater environments across the continent, and several lineages had reached sizes and hunting specializations that made rivers and lake edges as dangerous as open terrain. Uranosentrodon reached 4 meters in South Africa, the same region occupied by gorgonopsids and therocephalians, which meant that any animal coming to water to drink was entering the territory of a 13-foot ambush predator, built along the same body plan as a giant salamander or crocodilian. In European Russia, the Aricana petantids reached 3 meters in genera like Melosaurus and were capable of operating both in water and on land. Protoroseuchids, reptiles with crocodilian proportions and needle-like teeth, were present on virtually every continent, hunting from the water's edge or from the shallows. Some therocephalian genera were also semi-aquatic. There was no boundary in the Lopinian landscape where predator pressure dropped to zero. On land, gorgonopsids and therocephalians. At the water's edge and in the shallows, temnospondyles and protoroseuchids. The freshwater environment didn't offer different rules. It offered different predators, operating by the same logic. An animal moving toward water to escape something on land was, in most cases, moving towards something else, waiting in the water. Every environment covered so far has returned the same answer: occupied, dangerous, and offering no clean exit from the pressure below it. But the Lopingian world had one dimension that the others didn't. Not every zone was structured around predation from above. In fact, one of them carried almost none at all, not because something safe had evolved to fill it, but because what would eventually make it dangerous hadn't evolved yet, and what had previously made it large was already collapsing. The sky of a Lopinian Pangaea was defined by what it didn't contain, and that absence had real consequences for any animal small enough to reach it. Every environment discussed in this story so far has carried the same basic property: predators present, options limited, the cost of movement high. Open land meant gorgonopsids and therocephalians. River edges meant temnospondyles and protoroseuchids. The ocean, for different reasons, offered its own set of constraints. The question of where a Lopinian animal could exist with the least exposure to being killed has so far returned the same answer every time it has been asked. But the Lopingian world had one dimension that the others did not: vertical space. The relationship between what lived on the ground and what moved above it is not constant across Earth's history. In the Mesozoic, that vertical space would eventually fill with pterosaurs reaching wingspans of 10 meters and capable of taking substantial prey from the air. The sky in those periods was not a refuge. It was another zone of predation, operating above the terrestrial one and adding a direction from which danger could arrive. The Lopinian sky was organized differently, not because of anything that had evolved to inhabit it safely, but because of what had not yet evolved and what had already collapsed. The result was an aerial environment that carried almost none of the threat that the ground below it did. The sky over the Lopingian was defined by what it didn't contain. But the absence of aerial predators during the Lopinian was not a permanent feature of the world. It was a temporary condition produced by a specific sequence of prior events. And understanding it as temporary changes what it means. The sky was safe because the animals that would eventually make it dangerous hadn't evolved yet. Pterosaurs were tens of millions of years away. The insects that had made the Carboniferous sky genuinely large were in decline. What filled the air were gliding reptiles the size of bats, feeding on insects, posing no threat to anything vertebrate. But that condition came with a hard ceiling on who could actually benefit from it. Vertical space in the Lopingian required being small enough to access it, small enough to reach the trees, small enough to glide between them, small enough to sustain the energy budget that arboreal movement demands. For the herbivores most at risk from the large predators patrolling the surface, the heavier, slower, ground-dependent animals that made up most of the Lopinian prey base, the sky was not a refuge. It was simply inaccessible. The one safe zone the Lopinian offered was physically unavailable to the size classes that needed safety most. But even for the small animals that could exploit vertical space, the trees of the Lopingian were not continuous canopy. Peltosperm seed ferns formed thin, patchy forests in the habitable zones. Moving between them meant returning to the ground, which meant re-entering the zone where the largest predators operated. The sky was the safest dimension of the Lopingian world, but it offered safety only in intervals, not continuously, and only for animals small enough to reach it in the first place. The sky during the Lopinian was the one dimension of this world where the pattern broke. The giant insects of the Carboniferous, griffin flies, Paleodictyoptera, had already collapsed in diversity and number following the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. What remained were not abundant, not dangerous to vertebrates, and not ecologically significant as predators of large animals. Pterosaurs hadn't evolved yet. The largest things in the air were Weygeltosaurids, gliding reptiles no bigger than a large bat, feeding on insects, spending most of their time in trees. This was a meaningful fact for any animal that could exploit vertical space. Trees in the Lopingian, primarily peltosperm seed ferns, were not particularly tall or numerous, but they existed in certain habitats, and any animal that could reach them reduced its exposure to the predators below. The sky itself posed no threat from above. That is a specific and unusual condition. In the Mesozoic, giant pterosaurs capable of taking prey the size of small dinosaurs patrolled the air, meaning every dimension of that world carried a threat from above. The Lopinian sky carried none. The one zone in Lopinian Pangaea where an animal could exist without facing predation pressure from above was vertical space. It was a genuine refuge in a world that offered almost none anywhere else. available only to animals small enough to reach it. Below it, every other zone was occupied. The sky was the one zone that carried no threat from above. But the Lopingian had a danger that existed entirely apart from its predators, one that Pangaea's own configuration as a single unbroken landmass had built into the continent itself. It covered every stretch of terrain between the habitable zones. It couldn't be outrun, couldn't be armored against, and didn't respond to any behavior an animal could produce. What it did to the land, and what that meant for anything trying to move across it, is the part of the Lopinian story that the predators tend to overshadow. Everything covered so far has been biological. Predators, prey, the evolutionary arms race playing out between them across the habitable zones of Pangaea. But the Lopinian had a threat that operated entirely outside of that biological system, one that did not hunt, did not respond to prey behavior, and could not be escaped by being faster or better armored or more reproductively successful than the thing pursuing you. It was structural, and it covered the entire land surface of the planet. Pangaea's configuration as a single unbroken supercontinent had consequences for climate that went well beyond what any modern continent experiences. A landmass that size, fused together without internal seas to moderate temperature or distribute moisture, behaves differently from a fragmented world where ocean currents can carry warmth and rainfall into interior regions. The interior of Pangaea had no equivalent moderating system. It sat exposed to solar heating without the buffering effect that surrounding ocean provides to continents of normal size. And the result was a climate of extremes that made large sections of the land surface functionally uninhabitable. This is the part of the Lopinian story that gets the least attention, because predators are more immediately legible as threats than geography and temperature. But for any animal that needed to move between the pockets of survivable habitat scattered across Pangaea, the climate removed the possibility of safe passage between the places where life could be sustained. And that removal was as effective as any predator trying to cross it. But the deserts of interior Pangaea were not simply hot. They were hyper-arid in a way that compounded the temperature problem significantly. Heat without moisture is survivable for periods of time. Heat combined with near-total absence of water is not, and the equatorial interior of Pangaea offered both simultaneously across enormous stretches of terrain that any animal moving between the habitable pockets of the north and south would have had to cross. The survivable zones were real, but the corridors between them were not. But the central Permian mountains added a further complication to the northern route. Mountain ranges create their own local climates, and ranges running the full horizontal length of a continent create drought conditions on their leeward side that can persist across geologically significant timescales. Animals attempting to reach the northern river basins from the southern floodplains weren't just crossing desert. They were approaching a range whose rain shadow had been drying out the land on its far side for millions of years before any of them were born. But the most significant implication of the climate isn't what it did to individual animals crossing bad terrain. It's what it did to the structure of Lopingian land life as a whole. By concentrating life into a small number of geographically separated pockets, the climate concentrated predator pressure into those same pockets. The survivable habitats weren't just where prey went. They were the only places with enough prey to sustain large predator populations. And those predator populations had been scaling up for the duration of the Lopingian. Every animal that could survive in those zones was already there, and the ones that had evolved to hunt them were there too. The danger of Lopingian land wasn't only biological. The physical environment itself was a threat that operated independently of every predator on the continent. Interior Pangaea had no ocean currents to moderate its temperatures, no coastal systems to push rainfall inland, and no geographic diversity to create microclimates across large regions. The result was an average land temperature of 35 degrees Celsius at low latitudes, not a record high, but a daily average, with seasonal peaks far beyond that in the most exposed interior zones. The equatorial deserts were not marginal. They occupied enormous portions of the continent's midsection and separated habitable zones from each other across distances that required crossing dead terrain. The central Permian Mountains extended across the full horizontal length of the continent, blocking moisture and creating drought conditions across the northern interior. Life concentrated where water was available. South African floodplains, Russian river basins. Everywhere between those pockets was essentially hostile ground. Any animal in the Lopinian that needed to move between habitable zones faced the climate as a direct obstacle. Dehydration, heat exposure, and predator encounters across ground with no cover. The seas, despite their post-extinction quiet, had none of these additional burdens. Temperature in the open ocean was harsh by comparison to earlier periods, but it was at least consistent. Land offered predators and a climate that exhausted anything trying to move through it. The survivable zones of Lopingian Pangaea were small in number and surrounded on all sides by terrain no animal could cross safely. That was the baseline. Isolated pockets of habitable land, already saturated with predators, already running hotter than almost any period before them. And then, at the end of the Lopinian, something began in what is now Siberia that made the baseline look like a period of relative stability. The Permian-Triassic extinction is the most destructive event in the history of complex life on Earth. And what it did to land, specifically, and in ways that the sea did not experience in the same form, is the final piece of what makes this period the specific exception it was. At some point in the late Permian, roughly 252 million years ago, a sequence of events began in what is now Siberia that would go on to become the most destructive interval in the history of complex life on Earth. The Lopingian world, already shaped by the Capetanian extinction, already dominated by large saber-toothed predators, already running hotter and drier than almost any period before or after, was about to encounter something that made all of that look like a stable baseline. The event is called the Permian-Triassic extinction, known informally as the Great Dying. That name was not chosen casually. The fossil record on either side of this boundary is so different that, without knowing the dates, you could be forgiven for assuming you were looking at two separate planets rather than the same, one separated by a geological transition. The scale of what was lost in a geologically short period of time has no parallel in any other extinction event that Earth has produced. What caused it, how quickly it unfolded, and why its effects were distributed the way they were across different environments are questions that paleontologists have been working through for decades. The broad outline is now reasonably well established, and what that outline shows is a sequence of overlapping catastrophes that did not give land or sea any real opportunity to absorb one blow before the next arrived. But the Siberian traps were not a single eruption that ended and allowed recovery to begin. They were a sustained volcanic episode, lava flows building across a time frame long enough to produce overlapping environmental catastrophes rather than a single acute shock. The CO2 released didn't spike temperatures once. It drove a progressive warming that compounded with existing Lopengian heat to push land surface temperatures past the tolerance thresholds of most complex life. Organisms that had survived the Capetanian extinction survived the predator pressure of the Lopenian and persisted through the hostile climate of interior Pangaea, now faced a warming event layered on top of everything that had come before. But the oxygen collapse is the part of the Great Dying that receives less attention than it deserves. Hypoxia events, intervals where atmospheric oxygen dropped below the threshold for sustained aerobic activity, did not simply make breathing harder. They made sustained movement impossible for animals above a certain body size. Large therapsids that had built their ecological success on speed, endurance, and the ability to run down prey or escape pursuit were, during hypoxia events, unable to sustain the activity those behaviors required. The predators that had dominated Lopinian land were specifically disadvantaged by the conditions the Great Dying produced. But the ozone damage compounds the picture further still. Ultraviolet radiation at the levels the volcanic gases produced does not discriminate between predator and prey. It damages DNA in any organism exposed to open air, disrupts photosynthesis in the plants that sustained herbivore populations, and removes the viability of surface existence for any animal that couldn't shelter from it. The land during the Great Dying was not simply hotter and lower in oxygen. It was also actively irradiated. The sea, warming and acidifying as it was, sat beneath a water column that UV radiation does not penetrate to any significant depth. Everything described about Lopengian land, the predators, the climate, the lack of safe corridors, was the baseline. What happened 252 million years ago made the baseline look survivable. The Siberian traps erupted and didn't stop. Lava flows built up over a kilometer thick across a region the size of Western Europe. The CO2 and sulfur pumped into the atmosphere drove temperatures in some land regions to the year-round equivalent of Death Valley in its hottest month. Oxygen levels dropped repeatedly, causing hypoxia events across the land surface. Ozone layer damage from volcanic gases may have increased ultraviolet radiation by more than 5,000% in certain regions, meaning sunlight itself became a biological hazard. By the time the extinction ran its course, 57% of all biological families and 83% of all genera were gone. The KT extinction that ended the dinosaurs took out roughly 17% of families. The Great Dying was more than 3 times more destructive across every metric. The seas suffered as well. Warming and acidification collapsed marine ecosystems. But sea surface temperatures during the extinction's peak rose to the warmth of a hot bath rather than the lethality of an open furnace. Land animals faced radiant heat, toxic air, UV radiation, and total ecosystem collapse simultaneously. The animals that survived into the Triassic from the land, including the early ancestors of mammals and archosaurs, were almost uniformly small, fossorial, or capable of sheltering underground. Size was no longer a survival advantage. The Great Dying didn't just reset the land, it specifically punished everything that had evolved to dominate it. The predators are gone. The climate has done its worst. What crossed into the Triassic from the land were the smallest survivors, the ones that got underground and stayed there while the surface became lethal. What the Great Dying left behind is a record of which animals the conditions actually reached and which ones they didn't. Pulling that record together with everything that came before it, the emptied ocean, the escalating land, the freshwater predator networks, the isolated habitable zones, produces the answer to the question this story has been building toward: why the sea, during this specific window, was the place with the better odds. Every segment of this story has been building toward a question that most accounts of prehistoric life never bothered to ask, because the answer seems too obvious to require examination. Which was more dangerous, the land or the sea? In almost every period of Earth's history, the honest answer points toward the water. The ocean has consistently produced the largest predators, the most alien-killing strategies, and the environments least forgiving of any animal that found itself at a disadvantage. That assumption is so well supported across so much of geological time that questioning it feels unnecessary. But assumptions grounded in the general case can fail in specific ones, and the Lopingian is exactly the kind of specific case where the general answer stops being correct. The conditions that made the ocean dangerous in most other periods were not present during the Lopinian in the same form or the same degree. The conditions that made the land survivable in most other periods were also absent. What existed instead was an inversion, partial, time-limited, and produced by a very specific chain of prior events, but real enough to change the actual survival calculation for any animal operating during this window. Understanding why that inversion happened and what it ultimately meant for the animals caught inside it requires pulling together everything that the Lopingian record shows: the emptied ocean, the predator-saturated land, the climate, the freshwater systems, and the extinction that brought the entire period to a close. But the reversal the Lopingian produced was not simply a curiosity of timing. It was the result of two separate extinction events hitting two separate environments and producing opposite outcomes in each. The conditions that emptied the sea of its apex predators were the same conditions that opened the land to a faster scaling replacement. The conditions that kept the sea quiet were the same conditions that kept the land escalating. Those two trajectories ran simultaneously for 7 million years, and the gap between them is what made the Lopingian the specific exception it was. But what makes that gap significant beyond the Lopinian itself is what it demonstrates about the general principle. Danger in any environment is not a fixed property of that environment. It is the current output of that environment's recent history. What has survived? What has gone extinct? What has expanded into vacated space? And how long ago those processes began. The assumption that the ocean is inherently more dangerous than the land holds across most of geological time. But it holds because of what those environments have typically contained, not because of anything fixed about ocean or land as categories. Change what they contain, and the calculation changes with it. But the Great Dying closed the Lopinian window definitively. When the volcanic episode finished restructuring the land, the predators that had made it exceptional were gone alongside everything else, exposed to open air. What crossed into the Triassic from the land were small animals, burrowing animals, animals that had survived not by dominating the surface, but by avoiding it. The ones that could get underground, or stay small enough that the conditions above ground didn't reach them. The reversal ended not with a recovery, but with a replacement, and what replaced it was a Triassic world building toward entirely different configurations of predator and prey. The Lopinian record lands on a conclusion that is not complicated, but it is specific. During this window, roughly 259 to 252 million years ago, the sea was the safer environment, and the reasons were structural. Marine apex predators had been gutted by the Capetanian extinction 2 million years before the Lopinian began, leaving the seas without the kind of large, persistent predators that characterize most other periods in Earth's history. Land, at the exact same time, was experiencing the opposite trajectory. Gorgonopsids were scaling up. Therocephalians were diversifying. Freshwater systems had large ambush predators covering every river and lake edge. The climate was hostile to movement across the interior. There were no safe corridors, no low-risk zones, no environments on land that didn't carry significant predation or environmental pressure. When the Great Dying arrived and the land environment became lethally hot, hypoxic, and UV-saturated, the sea, though badly damaged, remained survivable in a way the land did not. The survivors from the land were the ones that could get underground or stay small enough that the conditions above ground didn't reach them. The ocean survivors faced acidification and warming, but not the specific combination of heat, oxygen deprivation, and radiation that made the land surface lethal. What the Lopingian ultimately demonstrates is that the relative danger between ocean and land has never been a fixed property of either environment. The Capetanian extinction gutted the sea. The land, left untouched by that same event, filled that gap with saber-toothed predators that dominated every continent until the Great Dying ended them. Those two facts, one extinction emptying the ocean, another extinction clearing the land, explain everything about why this specific window in Earth's history ran the rule in reverse. If this video found you at the right moment, a like helps more people find it too. And if you want more nights like this, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you.